My name is Megan Dettenmeyer. I'm the Forestry Extension Educator here at Utah State University. I recently became aware of Chuck's research in a U.S. Forest Service Science You Can newsletter. And I enjoy receiving those. I think they happen once or twice a month. And they really provide a succinct summary of the interesting work that our Forest Service is doing, and I invited him to come and give a webinar today. He also was kind enough to allow us to republish the article in our Utah Forest newsletter. So I'm going to introduce him and just say a couple quick things about CEUs. If you would like to get CEUs for today's webinar, please follow the link to the Google form and fill in your information there. And that allows me to keep everything organized and get the CEU submitted within a week of the webinar. I think that's all I have to say about CEUs. We have 2 more webinars, Learn at Lunch webinars remaining in 2018. And then we have 2 special webinars that'll be occurring with the Joint Fire Science Network in November. So check out our website to learn more about those. And I think that's it. So I'm going to introduce Chuck now. So Chuck Rhoades studies the biogeochemical processes that regulate the delivery of clean water and the ones that sustain productive soils and forests. His current research involves soil and water responses to fuel reduction treatments, post-fire rehab activities, and wild and prescribed fires. For the past decade, much of Chuck's research has related to the watershed effects of extensive bark beetle outbreaks and associated forest management activities. So I look forward to hearing Chuck's talk today. You are muted, Chuck, so just a heads up, make sure you unmute yourself before you start giving your talk. And yeah, I'll hand it over to him. I'm noticing a couple things while Chuck is sharing his screen. Just make sure if you put your CEU information in the chat window, I'm not going to grab it out of that chat window. It's way too much work if people start doing that. So I need you to follow the Google link on our website to get CEUs. And I'll put the Google link in the chat window right now. Chuck, you can go ahead and click display settings and switch display so that we can, yep, you got it. All right.
Okay, how's that?
Nope, okay. Still seeing your note screen. You click display settings. I don't think you swapped it though.
There
you go.
How's that look?
Yep, looks good.
Okay. Well, good. Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here and in my office and having you there wherever you are out in web world. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Or morning, wherever you are, to talk a little bit about bark beetles. And I appreciate Megan inviting me to be part of this webinar series. I'd like to kind of give you a little bit of an overview of some of the work that we've done here in northern Colorado and southern Wyoming for the last several years. So let's see here. Okay, excuse me while I get my tech going here. There we go. Okay, so today I'd like to kind of focus a little bit on watershed effects. I'm part of a watershed research group, and that's where kind of our research is focused. I'd like to work through a little bit of what we've learned in terms of watershed effects of bark beetles and how some of the land use practices have influenced some of our findings. I think that's kind of novel. Talk a little bit about some of the management that's occurred as a result of the bark beetle outbreaks and some of the kind of cool emerging issues that we're seeing as the beetle outbreak is kind of in the rearview mirror, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time for discussions and to hear something about your experiences. So the bark beetle, I think, was a really kind of an eye-opening example of what climate change sort of will look like for forest ecosystems. It really brought the topic of forest health and climate and how various organisms respond to the forefront. The map you see is from a paper done in 2008 that kind of discusses the synchronous beetle outbreaks. There's various different species that are shown in this slide, and you get a feel for the fact that this is not just a local issue. It really kind of caught everybody by surprise. Bark beetles are native to Western forests, but this sort of level of synchrony was kind of unprecedented and really brought the conversation about climate change and forest health together, much like conversations about climate change and wildfires have. So in Colorado, we've seen, like in many places, we've seen an increase in temperature over the last 30 years. So statewide, there's an increase in an average increase of a degree, but more relevant, there has been a shift in the minimum temperatures, which are critical for bark beetle biology. The freezing temperatures kill beetles as they're overwintering, and so the lack of frequent cold snaps or prolonged cold snaps are very relevant to beetle survival, and that's been something that kind of set the stage for the beetle outbreak, the increase in temperature. A trigger was seen and looked at kind of post hoc by a number of researchers who identified that around 2002, which was one of the driest periods in the last several hundred years, that was kind of a trigger for when the beetle outbreaks really kicked off. So you see the 2002 drought here, and then you see the increase in lodgepole pine beetle activity here. This was a study done in Colorado. Colleagues from the University of Idaho have shown this for a number of different Western states. So again, you see summer droughts, and you see the increase in beetle activity following that. So the bugs kind of took advantage of the temperature and then the trigger from the drought and started things in 2002. And it was off to the races, and in many parts of the Western US, the consequences have been very dramatic. This is looking at British Columbia, Montana, and Colorado, showing things starting off in the early 2000s and peaking for all of these areas between 2007, 2009. And some of these totals are staggering. In British Columbia, they lost more than 5 times the size of Vancouver Island during this outbreak. Some of these annual increases in beetle incidents in Colorado were, the size of small eastern states. So it's a fairly dramatic effect. This is a snap of Colorado in the northern part of the state. That's the Wyoming border. This is North Park, and there's I-70 for those of you familiar with the area, I-25. This is basically the distribution of lodgepole pine in Colorado, and most of the acres of lodgepole pine in the state were affected to some extent. So this is what a beetle outbreak stand looks like in our part of the world, in northern Colorado. This is near Winter Park, Colorado, and the levels of mortality are fairly impressive. So whether you're talking about the number of trees or the amount of basal area, we lose between 40 to 75% of those of the mature trees, and that outbreak kind of goes from 0 to 600 miles an hour in about 3 years. So it goes from green trees to red or gray trees fairly quickly. Typically, that red phase is 3 to 4 years old, and then you have this prolonged gray stage after the needles have fallen off. So the research that we've conducted has been centered around the Fraser Experimental Forest, which is west of Denver near the town of Winter Park. And this is a long-term experimental forest operated by the Forest Service, and it's situated near the headwaters of the Colorado River and in the snow-dominated portion of the state of Colorado, which is the headwaters of several large rivers, and water coming out of Colorado kind of contacts a lot of our states. 18 of them touch Colorado water. It's a fairly important place to be thinking about water yield and also water quality. And that explains why this area was set up by the Forest Service back in the 30s to look at the effects of forest operations and harvesting on both water quantity and water quality. And that research has taught us a number of important things that have helped us manage forests and hydrology in western snow-dominated areas. And the nutshell story is what happens to trees and snow influences stream flow. So there are two main drivers: the interception of snow, snow that gets caught in the crowns and then can be evaporated out or sublimated away. That can be a fairly large amount of potential precipitation that's lost. So if you harvest trees, you can increase the amount of snow that makes it to the forest floor and is stable and becomes snowpack. Also, if you remove trees, you reduce the amount of evapotranspiration or the amount of water that's lost. So an increase in precipitation and a decrease in loss due to evapotranspiration, and the outcome of that is you can increase stream flow by harvesting in certain locations. You can increase the stream flow in a prolonged way. So so at Fraser, we have a study that's shown over 30 years increase in stream flow following a harvest in one of our watersheds. So we know something about harvesting, but we really didn't know anything about beetle outbreaks when things started, or the bug showed up at Fraser in about 2002, and our image was sort of predicated on this idea that if you harvest, you can increase, in this case, stream flow. We really had no idea. We assumed that when the trees die, they're not becoming stumps. There's probably still some interception going on. There are certain trees still left in the forest, so there's some amount of evapotranspiration, but we really didn't have a good feel for what that would look like. So we assumed there was probably going to be some kind of a lag and maybe a dampening in terms of our bark beetle effects. There was little pre-outbreak information to kind of base our understanding on. One study that we're familiar with in Colorado was from a beetle outbreak that happened in the 40s, and this was over near Steamboat Springs in the western part of the state, comparing a couple of rivers to an undisturbed, a non-bark beetle forest, so calibrating them against the undisturbed stream and then looking at changes over time. And the messages here are the great swings in variability. You can see that year to year, as a function of the amount of snow coming in, the difference compared to the reference varied a lot. So some years there wasn't a difference, other years there was a significant one. And the other point is that the effects were fairly lagged and were still prevalent after 20 or so years. So a fairly kind of interesting thing to be looking at. We need to have a lot of data to be able to kind of parse this water quantity question. Oops, what happened there? I think I just moved that. Uh-oh. Sorry, I think I
That's okay.
Okay,
No worries.
here we go. Yep, I touched the wrong keyboard.
Oh,
now
yeah,
are we
switch the displays again, and then sorry, you have to zoom through, I guess, the rest of the.
How was that? We're back.
There we go. Okay, now just skip through to where we left off.
I'm playing with various mouses and keyboards here, so it's beyond my tiny brain.
No worries. There you go.
Okay, so the other piece of preliminary information that we caught our attention was from a beetle outbreak in Bavaria, where there was an 85% loss in spruce and a very large increase in the amount of nitrate leaching. And this actually got to the point where it was a concern from a human health perspective. This is an area unlike what we have in Colorado, where they have very high nitrogen inputs to start with, and so the increased mortality kind of pushed things over the edge. But the point was there was a large signal that happened and peaked within about 5 years and persisted for something like 7 years, where we had very high leachate before kind of descending, and the response or the recovery was really a function of the recovery of the understory vegetation. So that was kind of a noteworthy thing that caught our attention at the beginning of the outbreak. So moving to some of our research, one of the first studies that was installed by a colleague of mine, Rob Hubbard, who was interested in watching trees die in an ecophysiological way, and he compared live trees and trees that were being attacked by bark beetles, looking at the amount of water that was moving up through them, their evapotranspiration. And what you can see, this is kind of comparing live and dying trees, is that within about 2 weeks of being attacked by bark beetles, you already start to see a change in the water use, which is really pretty surprising. Usually we see fading trees the year after trees are hit, fading foliage, but this gives us an indication that within a few weeks they're already starting to stress out and die, and that has implications for flammability of foliage and so on. But the point is that the bugs are hitting them quickly, and this is consistent with the idea that when the beetles enter the tree, they also inoculate the tree with fungal spores that spread rapidly through the xylem of the tree, and block the water use very quickly. If we looked in the soils, in sort of across that transition from live trees to ones that have been hit 1 to say 3 years, and others that have been dead for 4 years or so, we see increases in soil resources. So soil moisture is higher, as one might expect, since the trees are no longer using it, and nitrate, which is taken up with soil water, that also increases, and both of these things stay elevated after the trees have died. The point to make here is that this happens while the trees still have needles, so it's a function of the plant uptake or the lack of plant uptake rather than a large change in the abiotic conditions in the forest. So given this, you'd expect that we might see changes in stream flow or the nitrogen in streams. And so what we have here is 30 years of data looking at the pre-bark beetle outbreak in 4 different watersheds at Fraser experimental forest, and then a decade of data after the beetle outbreak. So you'll see large seasonal patterns, ups and downs over the years, and in some cases, this is a catchment that had some harvesting in it, so you can see the decline after harvesting. But you don't really see any outstanding changes in stream nitrogen. We were fairly unimpressed with what we saw here. So you can see maybe a little bit of a change in some of these things, increased spikes in some of them, but nothing really overwhelming. Shortly after the beetle outbreak happened, we were at a workshop with scientists from USGS, several of the local universities, and various other researchers in the area, and we all kind of came together and found that we were all finding these very sort of weak trends, and that was kind of surprising. The reason that we study nitrogen and nitrate is that it tends to be very responsive to forest disturbance. So following harvesting activities, following various different clear cuts, following wildfire, for example, in Colorado, we see long-term increases in nitrate. But the beetle outbreak is kind of this really unimpressive little blip down here. You can hardly see it compared to the several 100%, up to 1,000-fold increase in nitrate following these other disturbances. Looking across a number of watersheds in northern Colorado, Dave Clow from USGS looked at the various factors that were influencing stream nitrate and found physical characteristics, relief, elevation, how much forest cover, precipitation, those all had fairly large effects on what was going on with stream nitrate. But the amount of beetle outbreak in these various years didn't really have a whole lot to tell us. So we were kind of surprised at what was going on with that. Okay, so at Fraser we have a nice legacy of different forest harvesting treatments. These were paired watershed studies, like I mentioned before, that were aimed primarily at talking about how forest harvesting, and you can see in this case the removal of about 50% of the basal area, how that influenced stream flow, and subsequently how that influences water quality. So we have catchments that are dominated by old growth forest, and some that have a mixture of old and new forests, and that provides kind of a nice setting for comparing how different catchments respond to bark beetles. It's probably two end members of what we would see across a lot of watersheds in the western U.S. So this red hand of death picture is kind of a good demonstration. This is from that same watershed. This is Full Creek, and this is it again here. And basically what you're seeing are the dead old growth trees and the younger, smaller trees that were below detection for the bark beetle. And one of the things that is kind of common knowledge, but we see very clearly in this graph, is that large trees don't stand much of a chance when the bark beetles come in. The smaller trees survive. So above about 6-inch diameter, we lost over 90% of the trees at Fraser. So the small trees were not killed and continued to grow and respond. So our catchments that have a larger proportion of those smaller trees tend to change less. They all lose the large trees, so 60 to 80% of those big trees die regardless of the catchment, but there's a larger remaining stocking in these mixed basins, the ones that have some amount of younger trees in them. So if we go back and we look at our stream chemistry with that in mind, I'm showing the two old growth basins. These are all older and larger trees, and then we see two of the catchments that had some amount of harvesting. Full Creek had about 50% harvested, and Dead Horse had about 30% harvested. And what you'll see are significant increases during various times of the year. So this is as snowmelt happens. This is kind of the summertime falling limb, and then base flow through the wintertime. We see that there are significant increases in our old growth stands, especially during the high flow period and the base flow period, not so much during the summertime when plant demand was highest. In our mixed basins, we see no increase in stream nitrogen. So catchment matters, and we see a larger effect in the catchments that have more mortality in them. Okay, so great. We have statistical differences, but do we care about that? And we've kind of added some of these numbers up. The main effects occur in our old growth basins, occur during the spring snowmelt, like I mentioned. So here you see pre-beetle and post-beetle in the spring snowmelt periods. And if we look at the amount of increase and kind of scale it across the year, we see about 1/10 of a kilogram or so of additional nitrogen coming into the system in these catchments. But that's really kind of a small chunk compared to the amount that comes in deposition, meaning that that's a very small new addition compared to, say, interannual variability and precipitation. And the implications of that is most of this nitrogen is taken up. These forests retain over 95% of the nutrients that come in, and this increase that we see is sort of an amount of leakage coming out, but it's a small amount relative to what's already coming into these systems. So water quality downstream is not likely to change as a consequence of this mortality, which is, again, sort of surprising. So so something's keeping these nutrients in the watersheds, in these watersheds, and wanted to kind of see whether that was possible and what other things people might have found. An earlier study done or in the Yellowstone ecosystem by Bill Rami tracked the growth of residual live trees following the beetle outbreaks in the 60s, and saw this kind of textbook increase in growth, a real nice thinning response that went on for 20 years, and a 2 to 3-fold increase in growth. So the trees definitely sort of feel the absence of their neighbors, and they grow into that additional space. We found a similar thinning response at Fraser. We looked at tree cores, both with lodgepole pine and Engelmann spruce, and you can see our hockey stick graph here looking at the increase in tree growth at the outside of these very old trees, which is kind of a surprise. Trees often grow slower as they get old. Some of these trees grew faster than they had in the entire ring width that we recorded, and 35% of them were growing more than 25% faster. So definitely an increase in growth for mature trees. For understory trees, ones that are perhaps the most likely to be to respond, the ones we would expect to see a response, we definitely see an increase in height growth that responds to the amount of overstory mortality. So both the amount of basal area that's lost, and then also the leaf area index, so the loss of foliage, help us explain an increase in the annual height increment of these trees that were sitting around in the understory near dead trees. And it does depend on the severity of the overstory loss. So a recent study that we did in different stands in this area showed places that lost about 85% of their overstory had a 3 or 4 times greater growth response than ones that only lost about 40% of their overstory. So these growth responses that we're seeing also have conferred changes in plant demand for nutrients. So if we see trees as they die, the foliar nitrogen content goes down, no big surprise there. But the neighbors of those trees actually have a nice sort of jolt of increased nitrogen, and so almost a doubling of the foliar nitrogen content that kind of relates to the amount of nutrient uptake. Okay, so there seem to be processes that might be involved in this nutrient retention, but are there people out there, are there trees out there that would be responding? This kind of gives a picture of the cup half full. We lost a lot of overstory, but there's still a lot of live understory trees. These are trees between 2.5 and 10 centimeters, pole-sized trees or advanced regeneration that is likely to grow quite quickly. I showed you the height graph from this tree size, and we can see the red line is a typical region 2 forest stocking number, 150 trees per acre or 370 trees per hectare, which would give you about 17 by 17 foot spacing, something that people consider to be a well-stocked stand as these grow up. So both our old growth and our mixed species or mixed age stands have plenty of advanced regeneration. There's quite a difference in species composition, so a lot of fir in the mixed age stands, and then also an increase in pine as well in the mixed age stand. So almost 2 times as much. So kind of as in summary of some of the watershed type stuff, I've kind of walked you through what we've seen as the initial response. We saw a reduction in water use. We see increase in soil nutrients following the mortality of those trees and soil moisture. So there's the availability for things to roll down the hill. But we don't really see that coming out as stream export. What we see is an increase in growth what's known as compensatory uptake. So we see an increase in the response of these trees. And this is kind of the important link. Without this advanced regeneration, without these live trees, we probably would have seen a much larger export story. And in forests that don't have good regeneration, that may be more likely to be the case. Okay, so I'd like to shift a little bit to some of the management that occurred in response to the bark beetle outbreak. And I've got an example here from the Arapahoe Roosevelt National Forest, which is near Winter Park. It was a kind of an area typical of Colorado that had a large increase in harvesting in the 70s, followed by a huge decline as mills were closed and timber programs kind of went out of business in this part of the world. The beetle outbreak kind of turned things on its ear, and we saw a very rapid increase in the amount of harvesting acres that went on in the Sulphur Ranger district and in this sort of epicenter of the beetle outbreak in central Colorado. So more clear cuts than at any time in the past, and this figure is a little bit out of date at this point. I'd say that that decade is probably the largest harvest decade in sulfur history. So a big change, as there was a increase in concern about fuels and fire risk, and you can see a lot of this area is very heavily infested by wooey as well as bark beetles. So there were lots of concerns. Nevertheless, in spite of the amount of management, the Forest Service at least will only touch a small percentage of the amount of acreage that were affected by bark beetles because of steep slopes and inoperable areas, wilderness, other designations. So probably 80 to 90% of those areas will not be treated. But I wanted to show you a little bit about some of the effects of the harvesting that was conducted in the initial years following the beetle outbreak. So across northern Colorado, we established sites at on various Forest Service land, state land, looked at a number of active harvest areas and compared harvested and unharvested units. And what we saw was kind of lodgepole and aspen silviculture 101. If you harvest and increase light into areas, these early successional species respond very rapidly, and so we saw large jumps in aspen density and in lodgepole pine density. Again, I've got the stocking numbers here, so these stands were all well stocked. In fact, even the uncut stands would have been well stocked. In the uncut stands, we saw kind of an increase in fir density as opposed to the light-loving pine and aspen. So if you grow those trees forward, this is looking at the density of trees and basal area over a century following these harvest activities or following the beetle outbreak, and you can see the large sort of cohort that come in of pine. You see a big jump in aspen, and you can also see what happens with the fir density in the uncut stands. So following harvesting, within about 100 years, or following the beetle outbreak, within about 100 years, we're back to the basal area of what the beetles first encountered. So it takes about 100 years for them to recover to the conditions they were in before, or the stocking. In the uncut stands, though, we have a shift in the dominance of fir. So we have an increase in the amount of fir, and this trend continues if we grow these forests out. And so we have stands that actually have a larger component of subalpine fir than we do of pine. The lodgepole condition is what we saw prior to the beetle outbreak. This fir-heavy forest is something rather unique and something we haven't seen in great densities in Colorado. So that's quite different, and that will have consequences for fuels, for fire behavior. So the pine mixtures will have a higher canopy base height, higher foliage moisture content, whereas the fir stands have lower crown bulk density or lower base height and higher bulk density, so perhaps more risk of crown fire in these kinds of stands. Okay, so I showed you just comparisons of harvested and unharvested, but there's a lot more that goes on, and a number of other decisions. We set up a kind of a common garden study across 12 different locations in conjunction with hydrologists, fuel specialists, silviculturalists in Front Range forests, and looked at a number of different options. So the bark beetle, a lot of the bark beetle response was sort of aimed at reducing fuels and protecting against risk within wildland-urban interface areas. Hydrologists had concerns and soil scientists had concerns about taking off all those nutrients, taking off that roughness. So we have a treatment where we applied a lop and scatter treatment. We compared it to a do nothing option, and then then in our area there's still a lot of interest in mechanical scarification to increase the density of lodgepole in some stands. So I'll show you just a few pieces of this information. So we planted trees into some of those treatments so we could kind of have a fair comparison, and we can see that there's an increase in lodgepole density in these harvested areas compared to the uncut area. You know, that seems kind of silly that we planted it in these areas, but because of the canopy mortality, there's actually quite a lot of light coming in. So there was good survival, but they didn't grow quite so well. More relevant to the management side question perhaps is that we see an increase in the growth, about 30% more height growth in areas where we had the lop and scatter treatment, as opposed to the whole tree harvester / removal treatment. Perhaps because of soil moisture, nutrients, or some other element that we haven't worked out yet. And this is work that we're still working on now and hope to publish soon. Of course, there were other resources that were of interest, and we looked at some of them. Just a quick shot. We looked at understory vegetation. Not surprisingly, we saw a decline in sort of the shade-loving shrub in this area. That's vaccinium. So in our harvested areas, that declined. It didn't really matter which of the various harvest treatments. Any clear cut kind of was not good for vaccinium. The scarification had a larger effect on total plant cover though, where we increased bare soil cover. We reduced the cover of all of our understory plants. We were concerned about Canada thistle, and we did see an increase in thistle presence in our harvested areas. So in 30% of our cuts, we saw thistle. Densities were very low, and perhaps not a long-term problem. This work was done in the first several years following the harvesting, and we would like to relook at that. We don't see thistle getting a foothold or continuing to be a problem in these sites. So a couple other things that are interesting about this beetle outbreak and topics that have come up. One is the idea that our standard best management practices require that we leave riparian buffers along streams in our harvest areas. Well, the question is, what happens if all those trees are dead? And are they actually doing anything? What would happen if a fire came through? Is that a larger risk in places where there are harvests along roads that infect that are next to streams? What are sort of the additional risks of taking away some of that SMZ or buffer zone area? And we wanted to kind of study this. We did a small scale experiment. This was set up in conjunction with Carl Chambers, a hydrologist on the Arapahoe Roosevelt National Forest, who was able to help us get variances so we could actually harvest along the streams and remove experimental areas of about 500 meters of of riparian forest down to the stream. We winched wood away from the stream, so we did it fairly carefully. And we compared uncut catchments or uncut hill slopes with hill slopes that had the typical 100-foot buffer zone, and then areas that had the buffer zone removed. And this kind of gives us an idea both of whether the dead forests are doing anything and whether or not what kind of risk there is for removing that dead riparian forest. What I presented here is inorganic nitrogen in leachate, and we see that there is an increase in nitrogen leaching in these areas below the harvested site. So this is an intact forest hill slope. This has a cut unit on top of it, and we see an increase. There was also an increase in leaching in the upland. So this is no surprise. It's good to see, though, that actually this is, a relatively small increase. These numbers in leachate are fairly low and not all that much higher than what you'd expect in stream water. However, when you take the buffer off and you take all of those trees out of there, we double the amount of nitrate that's in leaching, and that presents a little bit more of a risk to downstream water quality. However, these numbers still aren't all that high, and so potentially this kind of shows us that maybe not wholesale removal of riparian areas, but harvesting in fairly non-sensitive areas, in other words, where there aren't wetland soils, where there aren't shallow soils, in places where wood can be removed carefully for a fuel break, or in some sort of a small harvest area, that this may not present a huge risk. There's definitely more work that needs to be done on that. So we continue to harvest in Colorado, and we're way beyond where people thought we would. At the beginning of the outbreak, people thought we would only be able to harvest for about 5 years. Then the wood would all become checked and would fall down, and we would be out of the beetle salvage business. However, we've started looking at our blowdown or our tree fall rates, and some of our long-term plots of Fraser we've gone back and revisited. This is after a decade. And the big take home is that after a decade, we've still only lost about 10%, 12% in fact, of the dead pine, the beetle killed pine, which is kind of, a good and a bad thing. If you're interested in utilization, there may be some opportunities to continue salvaging. This rate will probably increase rapidly as stands begin to open up. And perhaps this will change within the next few years. It may be gone within another 10 years, but we still have a lot of wood out there. It's also a concern because some of the fuels issues are only going to grow and get much, much worse. Most of the wind throw that we've seen has been from trees that have rotted at the base, and so most of the volume of those trees is still in decent shape. It's still sound. A lot of them are elevated, as you see. So if harvesting in these areas is feasible, there may still be valuable wood out there to harvest. Okay, and so the next big question, we started out with concerns about fire, and in the last few years in Colorado, we've actually been getting them. There were very few beetle outbreaks. There were very few fires in red stage beetle forests, but now that we're in these gray face forests, we've seen an increase. We're up to about 130,000 acres of fires in the last few years. We've had 70 this year in Colorado, just in this sort of Colorado, Wyoming area. This is North Park. This is basically these are the recent fires. This is the Silver Creek fire that happened this year. The Ryan fire happened this year. The Badger Creek fire happened this year. This is the Beaver Creek fire that happened in 2016. So we're definitely getting an uptick in these beetle fires. And if we started to look at these thinking we would see similar results to kind of our harvest studies and what people have seen after fires in Yellowstone and other places where lodgepole pine comes back like a weed, and we figured we would probably find the same thing. And we've got 2 studies that we've been tracking, both that show something a bit surprising. So in 2010, there was a fire near Fraser, where we actually had some salvage units, and we were able to compare beetle-killed stands that had not been treated, beetle-killed stands that had been salvage logged, and then the burned areas, both harvested and not harvested. And we see some expectations, so an increase in fir in the areas that following the beetle outbreak. These are young trees, by the way. An increase in lodgepole pine following the harvest, so that all makes sense, but nothing in the burned areas in terms of conifers. This is for 4 years following the outbreak, and we were quite surprised. These were high severity patches where large amounts of cone consumption occurred, so there was very little left, which explains probably why these patches had no seed coming into them. The Beaver Creek fire is now 2 years old, and this is data from this summer, and we looked at old growth forest and then various ages of regenerating stands to see what the new tree densities look like. We see a nice cohort of new trees in the unburned areas following these are post-beetle new regeneration, but in the burned areas we basically wiped all that out. After 2 years, we should really start to see the new seedlings. We're going to continue to track this, but we don't expect that there's going to be a whole new cohort that shows up here. And in regenerating forests, we see the same sort of thing. This is Brian Harvey from the University of Washington's work looking at a lot of beetle stands around the Yellowstone area, and they found that the largest explanation of regeneration or the lack of regeneration are the presence of serotinous cones and the behavior of the fire, or the height of the crown. So at Beaver Creek we saw full consumption, that explains this, and in Beaver Creek we had very low serotiny, so that's kind of explains why we're seeing these findings. Okay, so to summarize, I wanted to show you that there are differences in sort of the responses of watersheds depending on species composition, and that can be regulated by pre-beetle harvesting. So stands that had younger trees, smaller trees, maybe respond less to ones that have larger trees, older trees, and more pine dominated. So not really surprising. There was an increase, we saw statistical increases, but the differences and the changes are probably not a large concern for downstream water users relative to changes in deposition. So 95% of all of the nitrogen coming in is retained even within those beetle-killed forests. There's a lot of opportunity for trees to respond and take those nutrients up. We see this sort of a compensatory change. So if you compare what we saw, very little response in nitrogen, to a clear cut, you have a much larger amount of plant demand that stays around in these forests, and that's a kind of a key point, because a lot of our responses rely on good regeneration. So again, like I said before, in areas where there is not good pine regeneration or fir regeneration, we may see larger responses in terms of stream nutrients. It also is an important thing to consider when planning for timber harvesting or any kind of management, that protection of that regeneration is critical. Even though the overstory is dead, the understory, the residual live material, is playing a really important role. It's obviously an important part of the future growing stock, but it's also mitigating the effects of watershed for water quality. Quickly through our management responses, we saw our salvage increased regeneration, even though we had pretty good regeneration even in uncut areas. Riparian harvesting may have had or did increase nutrients, but perhaps that may be something that could be managed wisely in areas where there's good regeneration that can kind of mitigate those effects again. So the idea of applying buffer zones, or I'm sorry, fuel breaks within riparian areas has some benefits and is probably worth looking at a broader scale. Our experimental scale studies probably don't really provide enough information. And then in terms of the fire, the post-beetle fire stuff, there are surprises. It's not going to be a textbook situation, and the beetle outbreak so far has broken a lot of the rules that we've had in terms of sizes of trees and elevations and periods. So we should just continue to expect more surprises as we move forward. And with that, I would like to hopefully open it up for some questions. I've got a list of some of our papers. This isn't all of them, but if you contact me, I'd be glad to share more with you, and hopefully I can answer some of your questions now.
Thanks, Chuck. We have about 150 people on the webinar, and I think everybody's been paying close attention to your presentation because I don't have any questions right now in the Q&A.
Perfect.
So I'll give people a chance to put those into the Q&A pod, and we will answer them as they come in. We still have about 8 minutes left, so plenty of time. I guess maybe I'll have Mark launch the poll right now. So if you are on the webinar and you don't have any questions, before you head out for the day, could you please take our quick poll, and you can move that off your screen if you want to. Just minimize it if you're not ready to do that. But that helps us evaluate our webinars and make sure that we're listening to our audiences and doing a good job. So I guess my first question is, it seems like you had a bunch of interesting observations and experiments set up in the past. What are you looking at forward? What's on the horizon?
Yeah, I mean our upcoming papers and our upcoming interest is really to kind of characterize the wind throw right now. There have been very few papers and studies that have looked at wind throw, and they've been great and highly cited, but they're in lower elevations and different forest types. Part of this pattern that we're seeing, the low wind throw at this stage, it may be because our forests are really high and very dry. We know that these wood on the ground in these forests takes 100 years to decay. So we don't have the fungi and the sort of decay situation that people in other wetter and lower elevations might have. So I think our findings might differ quite a bit from other places. So that's one of the things I'm most interested in. I'd like to look at the tree response in the understory relative to the gaps that are formed in those canopies. I think that will be very interesting. There's certainly areas where we see blowdown events where you see kind of a whole hillside go down, but it's not like we kind of expected where we would see that in large areas. We have seen it in some locations, but it's not terribly common. Unfortunately, we seem to see it where we don't have plots, so we can't really we don't really get to count those numbers. The other thing is the fires. I think that we've got new fire opportunities all the time, and I think that has a lot of relevance to downstream water quality. In some of these areas where regeneration is a concern, I think that will be really important to follow and to think about whether replanting will be needed and what that might mean for sort of those ecosystems moving forward.
Great. We have a question in the chat window. Boyd asks, in terms of the natural regeneration of lodgepole pine on Churches Park and Beaver Creek, is it too early to make a conclusion about regeneration?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think at Church Park it's not too early. 4 years for lodgepole following a fire. I mean, the lodgepole regeneration peaks within 3 to 4 years following a beetle outbreak. So 0 regeneration after 4 years, I think, is fairly conclusive. There certainly will be more coming in. And I think the point of that study is really that kind of bad things can happen, and it's not that they will happen everywhere, but that that is a condition that's out there. In places where you've got more of a moderate severity fire, that certainly would not have been the case. So so that, I think we just captured sort of a high severity. Beaver Creek, it's definitely too early. We'll continue to track that for another couple years. I didn't show you any of the aspen data. We definitely see aspen in some of those areas. We saw that at Church Park as well. Aspen didn't really respond negatively to anything. In other words, it was fine and didn't really respond too much to the increase in bugs, cutting, or fire. So we may see an increase in aspen in some of these areas, which is, that's a fine thing. We'll be watching that as well. These areas have high wildlife density, so aspen and wildlife, we may end up seeing some interplay there.
Christine asks, what happened with regrowth in forest areas that were not treated before fire?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and something that we definitely were setting our studies up to look at. Areas that were untouched, we saw new trees coming in. So we see a cohort of new trees or a new generation of both pine and fir. The fir actually does really well, and we see an increase in its growth in those stands. I showed you some increases in height growth in uncut stands. So those trees are fine, thank you very much, and those stands are stocked. So for the large percentage of the landscape that will not be treated in Colorado, in this part of Colorado, I want to say, we're hopeful that we'll have pretty good regeneration. There are places where there is not good either advanced regeneration, so trees that were around prior to the beetle outbreak, maybe because they were much more heavy to lodgepole pine and didn't have the mixture with fir, those stands might not look the same. But in our areas, we see really good regeneration without doing any harvesting. So harvesting is not needed to regenerate the stands, that's for sure. If you do harvest, you end up setting those stands sort of on the trajectory that they were on previously. So in other words, lodgepole pine will be the dominant species. There'll be aspen as well, but they'll be growing kind of into the kinds of stands that we are used to around here, that we've seen fairly regularly in this part of Colorado.
Lou asked, do forest managers burn beetle-killed trees to encourage species exhibiting serotiny?
Foresters talk a lot about that. They don't do a lot of that, and it's fairly tricky. Burning in lodgepole pine is not something that people have a lot of experience with. It is something that people would like to try more. They're having more. They're letting fires go in these areas where they can, but lodgepole pine as a crown fire type of fire regime, it can be fairly unpredictable and fairly dangerous. And so doing that kind of operation anywhere where there are values at risk is pretty risky. So yeah, a lot of people have thought, boy, it'd be great if we could torch some of this off, but there have not been very many examples that I can think of.
You might pull up your Q&A window at the bottom of your screen, Chuck, for the next question. Sam, I'll read it to you. Sam asks, you showed a slide at the end from your PNAS paper. It showed relative nitrogen exports between clear cuts and beetle-killed watersheds.
Right.
Do you have a sense of how post-fire nitrogen exports look like on that figure?
Yeah, that's a good question, Sam. Well, we know that we know that fire has a very large effect on stream nitrogen. We have got a number of papers on that, and the response relative to bark beetles. I mean, the response following bark beetles is kind of response. It's very small, very muted, because we're we have a lot of seedlings left. So I would say that that kind of a mental exercise, you'd want to scale with the amount of mortality you have if you're talking about a high severity burn or a moderate severity burn, or whether you've got a lot of sprouting plants in the you know, in your landscape. So, you know, if you compared it to the work we've done at Hayman, I'd say we would be way up there near the clear cut end. We know that following Hayman, we had orders of magnitude increases in stream nitrogen following that fire in our high severity areas, and that's because there was no regeneration left. There's no, and we've had persistent responses to that for the same reason. There's very little regeneration, and so that plant demand piece remains broken.
And how big was the Hayman fire?
Hayman fire was the largest in Colorado history. It's 160,000.
Wow.
And at this point, 16 years later, it's still we still have catchments that are releasing nitrogen that, you know, 10 times above what they were prior to the fire.
Christine asks, follow up with regrowth after fire in areas where there was beetle kill as well. I'm not sure if that's a question. Christine, if you have more thoughts on that, fill it in for me. Let's see, I'm not seeing any other questions from folks. Chuck, would you mind sharing this last slide with me so that if people want a list of those papers, they could easily grab that, just maybe grab it and put it in an email. And if anybody wants to see a list of his
yeah, definitely. And there are more down here at this web link, but yes, I'd be glad to send that along.
Awesome.
And I'd like to acknowledge all of my collaborators. This is obviously a big long-term project. I've had a lot of help. Forest Service colleagues, as well as people at Colorado State, University of Wyoming, and the Biomass Alliance, which is a project run out of Colorado State University, and even Sam, who asked a question, who helped with one of these studies. So thanks to all of my collaborators, and thanks for paying attention.
Yeah, right. Well, thanks, Chuck. Thanks for giving a great talk today. This webinar was recorded, and it will be available on our website within the next couple of days or so. So please remember to take the poll before you tune out today. And thanks again for joining us, and everybody have a wonderful day. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Chuck.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.